Good afternoon. We're here for the launch of the quantum governance, the soft launch of the quantum governance book here, as you see. And I'm Anthony O'Sullivan, partner and director at Whiteshield. And I want to welcome the live audience that we have here globally, and especially the two eminent authors of this book, Quantum Governance, Fadi Farra, managing partner at Whiteshield, and Christopher Pissarides, who's special advisor, director for Whiteshield, and also Nobel Prize winner in economics. Welcome.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
So we're going to have a setup here in which I'm going to ask you a series of questions so we get a good idea of what quantum governance is about. And then we'll turn to the audience live to address some of your questions. And you have a chat function for questions, so please start ahead during this session, and then we'll just have a brief summary at the end. Mm-hmm. All right?
Good.
Okay, so let's get started here. Now, I'm curious about this quantum governance book, and I would like to know, Fadi Farra, turning to you, what is unique about quantum governance, and why is it important now to be launching this book?
Anthony, thank you. Maybe to start with the premise of the book and maybe what are the key messages of that book. The premise is what works and what doesn't. And if you step back, when we started this book about 5 years ago, we looked at what doesn't work. Well, many things don't actually work. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals over the past 10 years and looking ahead, only one SDG is on track to perform. Most of the others are not going to be on track. If you look at labor productivity in the Eurozone or even going forwards, there's a decline or it's stagnating. So the question is, what is development? Are we really developing or is there inertia? Now, we can find many things that don't work, but the things that work, well, let me maybe take my phone here, that actually works. When I look at what my children do, or when I look at what any of us do, where there's an interdependency with what's in here, which is the data, which is in that little phone here, that interdependency is the ability to get influence and to buy things online going through a journey. That marketing journey, that one-to-one marketing journey, which is working very well, and you're going to download apps and you're going to buy new items, is working for all of us as consumers. But that one-to-one marketing hasn't moved to one-to-one policy. And that is the first message of this book, to move from one-to-many to one-to-one. Now, what does one-to-many mean? It means that today policymakers will tell us about the public sector, the private sector, even one UD block called the people, when we have the power of data that allows us to really tailor and adapt policies to different individuals. That's the first message. And if I give you a few cases, for example, in education in the USA today, we have the individualized education programs with the IDEA program, where you can have one-to-one education, where you can have one-to-one healthcare. For example, this is happening in Germany with genetics programs. It's happening in the UK. That allows us to potentially reduce the cost of health and therefore have much more impactful health policies. The same applies to labor in Denmark with flexi-security, where different contracts can be adapted to different individuals. It's just the beginning, but the main question here, and therefore the second message of the book, is what is called the absorptive capacity of individuals. Because if I use this phone, and if I use the marketing analogy that I took, well, I'm going to convert this data and whatever is tailored to me into a purchasing of something. Well, in policy, it has to have impact. It has to have a result out there. That is the capacity of citizens to absorb a certain level of information that the policymakers are conveying. That absorptive capacity, 5 years later, today, and millions of data points that we analyzed, and through the algorithm that we developed, basically showed us three types of countries, if I take countries as units of analysis. One type of country that is spending too much energy, and where the citizen absorptive capacity is very limited, the USA, some countries in the Gulf, for example, therefore not being very efficient. Some countries that are not doing enough, and where the citizens have a very strong absorptive capacity. And that would be, for example, Costa Rica, that could be countries like Thailand. Others are doing very well, are matching that level of energy with the level of what we call quantum learning, this absorptive capacity. And this link is, for example, Ireland or Iceland, or even countries like Gambia that are doing very well. That's the second message. And the third message is the need to think as a whole of country. Today we have policymakers that are thinking education, that are thinking finance, that are thinking investments, that are thinking environment, but not connecting the dots between the different policies. For this, we developed a periodic table, 72 policies of all public policies and how they interact among each other. But beyond this, we put together something called the balance of policy. And that is an attempt to replace GDP, to think much more in the age of data, where we've moved from a factor of production that was land to a factor of production that was labor, that was capital, and government is still stuck in that age, where we talk about metrics like GDP, like balance of payments. We haven't moved from this. And here we're attempting to give an answer to the age of data with the balance of policy. Now, concretely, this means that we're working with governments to put in place program where we adapt to different types of citizens on employment measures, where we complementing some of the accounting metrics with the balance of policy with some countries to rethink how policy should be seen.
Excellent. Thank you, Fadi.
Thank you.
Clearly, there are lots of messages in this book, and it's quite ambitious. For now, I'll retain for the wider audience here the one to many, from one to many to one, right, as a conceptual direction. So we're looking to impact the individual citizen, customize policies to the individual citizen, and we'll drill down further on some of these other points. But I'd like to turn to Christopher Pissarides here, and maybe a broader question, Chris, is in the current context, from what you've observed, why is it important right now to be thinking about the redesign of public policy in general?
Yes, well, good question. I should say, though, that my co-author here managed to steal all the points that I was preparing to give you, so here is one obsolete piece of paper here. Very good, very good summary. Let me backtrack a little bit from what Fadi was saying, given your question. And it is that government policy nowadays is becoming more and more complex, simply because societies are becoming more complex. You know, the diversity of occupations we have, the different economic activities that people have, the combination between the economic and the social are becoming so complicated that having just one blanket policy, even within sectors, that one size fits all will simply not work. It's going to hit some kind of bottleneck. There's going to be some people who are dissatisfied. We are seeing demonstrations taking place, and I don't think any country has escaped them. Sort of objections from citizens when it comes to public policy, and the reason is that the policy is not well targeted, given the needs that people have. And there isn't enough preparation across the board when it comes to designing a policy and making sure that it works well. You know, for example, if you want to increase the speed at which we travel from point A to point B, you don't go and construct railway carriages before you put the lines on the ground, because it will not work. You know, the society will not be able to absorb that service if we can put it in more formal language. Now, the examples I had here were Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, because that's where governments failed dismally throughout, because they haven't done enough to prepare societies for the greening of our economies, and so forth, and so on and so forth, that Fadi discussed. Then we had the problem of productivity slowdown that people keep saying is a puzzle. I mean, to me, it's not a puzzle. It's simply because we don't have the skills, and especially we don't have this combination of skills, technology, and capital investment that will give you higher productivity. Of course, governments are aware of that. They had endless committees, commissions to study the productivity problem. That's what they all come up, but they don't seem to be succeeding. And if I mention one, which is my own, is the social support the government gives to individuals according to their needs. Here, of course, the flexicurity system of the Danes, the Dutch, and further north, Sweden, Norway, is where it succeeded. Governments should take on the responsibility of giving social support. I mean, the employer obviously should contribute, and I'm going to come up to that point, in fact, in a minute. But that really should be the remit of governments. Now, how do you provide that? If you're going to provide support for the unemployed, different types of unemployed people, different demographics have different needs. If you're going to target disability support, then people have different needs. You know, do you treat mental disability in the same way as physical disability, for example, to support, to help them becoming more active in society? Obviously not, but if governments don't have the information, that's what they do. So this is one important area where data would help. Now, the other bottlenecks that we find frequently is the absorbing capacity that we already mentioned, so I won't say anything more about that. The other one, which is very important, and it's ignored, I think, because of the way that government is organized into different decision-making units, different ministries, who then apply to the Treasury for funding and discuss it in the cabinet, that each minister, if you like, campaigns for their own little area, which they are subsequently going to say, look what I've achieved, and expect to move further up in the government hierarchy, for example. But we know, and it's been known for a long time to economists, in fact, that there are complementarities between policies, and if you implement them together in association in the right sequencing, for example, or simultaneous in some cases, they become much more effective as policy support. For example, you know, again, borrowing from the labor market, if you're going to give incentives to companies to invest in certain particular activities, there might be activities related to R&D, well, you'd better make sure that you're also giving incentives to workers to go into those activities, so that they both work together, and the return that you get on your policies is much bigger. That's another aspect that needs the data to analyze it. And finally, something that is very, very close to my heart is that I do think policymakers spend far too much attention to GDP growth as an objective and as a way of evaluating policy. I think they do it because they don't know much about alternatives to emphasize, despite many efforts that have been made. Ironically, when it comes to deliberating what policies to follow, the emphasis and most of their attention is not given to GDP growth. You don't get every minister thinking, what can I do to increase productivity? You get them to say, you know, what needs does my constituency have? Do we have too many disabled? Do we have too many single mothers? Do we have too many unemployed? They're thinking about all these things, you know, how are labor standards? Essentially, what they're thinking about is how to improve the well-being of their community. And yet, when it comes to the headlining newspapers, you don't read, oh, well-being has increased last year because of government policy. You get GDP growth is now 0.5% higher. Well, so what? Especially when it comes to countries like the United States. They're already up there. The fact that they went up to here or here, why is it so important to attract big news? And again, the reason is that we don't have the data again, how to evaluate well-being, although there is very good work being done now, a combination of psychologists and economists. But someone needs to make that available to government and give government the tools that they can use to enact the right policies that will have an effect. And that's what they will know how to do it when they read Quantum Governance.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. This is fascinating. And you're right that GDP has long been associated with things like well-being implicitly, but it hasn't actually been measured. And there's increasing debate here, and I think quantum governance is looking to address that as one of the issues. Can I zoom in on something? I would like to go further with Chris here, because you received your Nobel Prize in labor economics a few years ago, and things have changed a bit, evolved since then. And if we take into account some of the lessons that we have from quantum, and we take a case like the Danish flexi-security model that you mentioned, right, which already is adapting things in terms of policy between the protection of the worker and the flexibility of the market for the employers. How would you imagine this might be taken further by applying some of the quantum principles?
Well, first there is the social support. To be most effective, you need to provide social support for a short time so that the worker could self-select, as we say. In other words, the worker would gather information on their own in the market. See, they know their preferences and their abilities much better than anyone else, even though most workers exaggerate their abilities, but at least they're in the right direction. So let those workers, first of all, do it on their own, as it were, in the labor market. See if they find some, just give them as much information as possible. So at the first stage, information transmission from government to the worker. If things don't work out, then you need to provide help. Now, here is where you need to provide different kinds of help to different types of workers, because they need different. You know, if you have an unemployed mathematician, you don't provide the help by teaching them more mathematics. You know, you do it by teaching them a little bit about markets, how markets work and how the economy works, for example. You know, and to do that, then you need the quantum approach to policy. Now, a second thing that is very close to my heart, if I might mention, the big problems that we're facing now in labor markets are how to deal with the new technologies that are coming along. You know, we had robotics, and there was panic that they were going to take our jobs. In fact, they didn't. The countries that install most robots are also the most successful ones in retaining employment positions in manufacturing. You know, Germany, South Korea, Japan, the manufacturing sectors are the most active, and they're by far the ones that use in most robots in manufacturing. We predicted it wrong there. Again, we didn't make very good use of data. Now we've got AI, a new panic. We're going to lose our jobs. We don't know what they're doing. ChatGPT can write any essay that any student can do. Education will be thrown out the back door. Panic. You will not believe how many invitations and things, comments I got. You know, what's happening in labor markets now with these new technologies, generative technologies and so on, which again, I think they're vastly exaggerated. But unfortunately, because workers see all those things in social media and they read it in the press, they watch it on television, they're panicking. You know, worker well-being is falling, although it should be increasing, because I think if we make good use of these technologies, it would improve both productivity and well-being at the same time. And that's why the government needs the data. The government needs to step in and regulate these technologies and make sure that they're used to improve conditions at work, not to send the workers panicking and say, when are my job going to go? Yep. Do you know that in surveys of workers' well-being, happiness and well-being at work, do you know the thing that workers hate most at work? When the boss asks to see them. because they're worried that the boss will say, by the way, we decided to install some new technology that has AI, and unfortunately your job will no longer be viable, amongst other things.
Yeah.
They should be happy when the boss asks them to go and see them. You know, I can talk to the boss what I discovered working for this company for so long, and provide more data to the boss. You know. And that's where, again, this needs to be combined with the flexicurity. Those who are unfortunate enough and lose their jobs, they go into the social support in the transition. Those that don't lose their jobs go into transitions within their company, and they learn how to work with the technology, which is applied under government guidance, rather than scare people off, or even worse, used for military purposes and all that, which unfortunately, as humanity, we do have the tendency to do that sometimes.
Unfortunately. Yeah. Unfortunately. Very good. Very, very clear. So we're talking about, you know, some of the positive uses of data for policy, and we'll come back to this more broadly. But here on this question of labor policy, so we're looking at more precise information for workers, which would help actually workers make better choices, right, and on a customized level. And then the second is more precise information on the needs for workers to develop their skills and enhance their skills, and maybe to search for the best opportunities. All of this, you can imagine, be customized. So this is the beginnings, the germination, if you want, of a one-by-one worker approach. It's very interesting. So of course, quantum governance, the book has very solid theoretical foundations, a whole series of equations which relate to namely to policy learning. And maybe, Fadi, if we turn back to you, you could elaborate further on this equation of quantum governance and tell us about it.
Of course, or maybe just to complement what Chris was saying, this book is not just about the how, it's about the what. So we're talking jobs, for example. Well, too often we ask, how do we create jobs? But we don't ask, what is a job? How do we define a job? And quantum is about rethinking what is goods. It's really stepping back and rethinking GDP is just one type of metric. How do we define goods? There are so many goods out there. Now, to do this, we started by thinking, well, development is not just GDP. Development could be anything. And maybe if we bring the board here, and I'll probably explain it with a few equations here. I'll keep it simple. The point of quantum governance is to say, on one side, you have quantum, which is the individual. In quantum physics, the quarks will be the lowest unit of analysis. In social science, well, we, the individuals, are the lowest unit of analysis. Now, why governance and why governments? Because government has a top-down perspective. Governance is a network. And in the age of data, there is interdependence between people. We cannot just think about government top-down, but rather governance between individuals. Now, what does it mean concretely? I'll draw here what we defined together with Chris, and I'll also mention Amir Ibn Saba and Elena Balter, who were fundamental drivers of the calculation of the book. The first question is, what is development? And then for this, we looked at one block, which is E, which is the energy. And energy is what government can do. What can government do? Well, government has a number of public policies. And we looked at this as a periodic table of public policies. More than 72 policies that are interdependent. But that's not enough. You have to have trust in the leadership of a government. That trust in leadership is a fundamental drive for a policy to be effective. But that's not enough. You need to have an administration which is efficient. And behind the administration, there is something called the narrative. The stories which are being put forward so that a population as one uniblock can understand what government is trying to do. Now, this exists since the dawn of times. Since the Stone Age, to the Pharaohs, to later on, there's been a certain amount of energy being put. But what we realized is that this alone wasn't doing it. Mathematically, that was creating an L-shaped curve where we were hitting a certain wall. Now, why were we hitting that wall? Because there was the other side of the equation. Us as people. And us is two blocks. On one side, there is the individual absorption, On the other side, there's the community absorption. The individual is what Bourdieu used to call the social capital, the economic capital, and the cultural capital. Now, those three capitals give us a certain prism, the way we perceive or the way we're going to absorb a certain policy. But that is outside of where the community is. And the community is going to be everything from the myths to the religion to the language to the codes, everything else that we cannot actually calculate. So what we did in this book was very simple. We replaced D by a normative good, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we said, well, if we know what SDGs are, and we can take all countries on the planet over a certain period of time, well, we can calculate E with plan here, and we can calculate I. This becomes our unknown. And by calculating this, we managed to look at what is the balance between energy and quantum. Why is it important? Because that balance is eventually what policymakers should aim for, because that allows you to have much more speeds in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.
Excellent. Thank you, Fadi, for that almost professorial overview of the equations. It's useful to have an acronym that says PLAN, you know, because then you remember it more.
It's the plan I see.
It's the plan I see. Very good. Okay, so that gives us the basics. We're back to school on that. I'm going to turn back to Chris on this question of data again. And this is more broadly, there was an article that you published recently in Project Syndicate on the links between data and policy good. And I was wondering if you could give us a bit of a balance sheet on AI and data relative to policy. Because there are some fears around this, and some of them are respectable and can be understood. For example, data can be used to assess workers in terms of their productivity in ways they never could before. And so you risk having more and more of a divide between the best and the worst. This is a bit, the Tyler Cohen direction, as an example. So what are some of the negatives that we agree on? But then could you re-summarize for us what are the fundamentals of data for good in policy, so we strike a better balance here and have less anxiety around AI?
Well, of course, that's the big question with data. On the one hand, data is the new gold, if you like, that if we have data, companies that have the big data are the ones that are succeeding because they know how to target their market. They know how to advertise their product. For example, you take your phone, I mentioned before, it's a successful technology. You open to do something, and then you see something advertised that is exactly along the lines of the thing you were intending to buy one of these days. And that's all driven by data. On the other hand, data can also be abused. We've seen it done many times in before political elections, for example, trying to shift people's political views. There is fake news that leads people to do things based on sort of information that is completely misleading and or wrong. And the question is, how do you regulate data or control its use so that it's mainly used for the betterment of society generally through government, through public policy? So you have many complications here. On the one hand is where you strike the balance. On the other hand, how do you make sure that government has access to these data? And then how do you know as the individual, because after all it's your data that is being used? And the answer is that we don't know yet. And that's what our article was hinting at. The European Union has the GDPR that's probably gone further than any other regulation of data to be used widely. Although we all know that most of the time you get onto a new website, of some new company you haven't used before, and it comes up and says, we value your privacy, we value your data, would you accept additional cookies or would you not? If you don't answer, you cannot move on. So you have to say yes, no. If you say no to using your data, then you don't get as good targeted information as you would otherwise. It's a big problem, but at least it's a good effort. And then you have other, like the United States, for example, has followed a different policy, and that it doesn't regulate the way European Union does, and it's a problem. Now the sort of big conundrum that we've raised at the end of that article, which leaves it as an open question, and it attracted quite a bit of attention actually. People got in touch with me, or I brought it up in sort of seminar presentations, discussions, and all that, and they asked is at least, okay, we have the data. There are companies that have loads of data. We know which ones they are. We keep giving them data all the time, all of us. How do we make sure government gets it and uses it to target public policy so that it reaches the people we want to reach, and it reaches them exactly where they have the need? And I mean, the answer to me is, I don't know. There are alternatives. When I ask people, some of them say, well, your government, force them. Say such and such a company, I want to have your data now because I want to use it to apply public policy, and society will be better off if it's done. The reading between the lines of what we did, the approach that we followed, was make sure that you develop the social conscience of these companies. You're going to do enormous good to the society that you're operating if you give us your data and let us apply it. Yes. I still haven't seen it in practice, but fingers crossed, I'm waiting.
So
it is a problem.
Fundamentally, I think we all agree here that the level of data here that we have on individuals is unprecedented. Right? Technology allows us to have that. And it can be used for either good or bad. That's it. And yes. in the end, the thesis of quantum governance, as I understand it from the two authors, is that we have an untapped opportunity in terms of how to use it for good, right? The question would also be the trust that people give to government and to companies in how this is used for good versus other uses.
To give you a follow-up example, actually,
yes, please.
I mean, it was quite astonishing, for example, in the big language models like ChatGPT. I mean, write your name in it, and it comes up with things about you that you didn't know they knew. And it doesn't do that by accessing your files and getting information from you. It does it by matching words that appear next to your name, generally on the web, and from there I construct a story about who you are, your interests, and all that. And despite the fact that these technologies are only a few months old, and their inventors are saying we are still in the trial period, there are still many mistakes being made, it's incredible how much accuracy there is.
Yeah.
So there you go. It just shows you how much information there is out there about each and every one of us.
Yeah. No, definitely. And so that you're demonstrating the power that exists right now. Yeah. Probably there's going to be some kind of need for regulation on making sure that power is used in the right manner, both for governments and companies. But maybe I turn back to Fadi. If you could give us even a further perspective on some of the tools that are provided by the Quantum Governance book. There's a number of different tools in there. And maybe you can just give us a couple of examples, things that are concrete for people to understand how this might be impacting policy.
But the first concrete thing I should do is to try to put my name on ChatGPT. I've never tried that. Look, the quantum governance, before we talk about the tools, is about rethinking the social contract. Social contract used to be, I trust government, I pay my taxes, government will give me a return on policy, and my life will be better. Now, we created something called the policy experience curve. It basically shows the interdependence between policies. So imagine education. Education influences many things, but probably has limited influence from other things. Now, on that curve, imagine an L-shaped curve like this. At the bottom, you have limited interdependency, which is typically taxation. And at the top, you have trades, non-tariff, you have the regulatory environment, open government, and so on, where interdependency is fundamental. Now, the discussion we're having with Chris was, well, how do we look at this? Is it a glass ceiling? Is it just a marginality? Well, the point of this curve is to show that the social contract should be changed. It should not just be about taxes. Maybe it should be about working with the GAFAs or other companies to say, you know, you give us data, or citizens, you share with us data, and we'll give you back a return on policy which is much bigger. That should be the new type of taxation. That should be, you know, what this curve is telling us. That policy learning curve basically is saying, look at policies that impact everything. Of course, we're in the UK. I'll have to mention Brexit as a policy. Well, Brexit is at the very top of that curve. Non-tariff and tariff barriers impact everything. Taxation impacts it less. That's the policy experience curve. But the most important two tools that we have put forward in that book, the first one is the periodic table of public policies. So for the first time, we put a periodic table of 72 policies that are interdependent. You have to think, like the periodic table in physics, you have some policies which are heavy, some which are light, some which are highly connected, some which are not. Why is it so important? Well, because you cannot look at public policy as just one or the other. They're all connected. And when the Minister of Education is putting in place a policy, they have to look at the impact on R&D, the impact on investment, on FDI, and so on. And that interdependency is what we're turning now into an algorithm to look at what does it mean for citizens. So the periodic table is something very concrete that can be used to look at interdependency between policies. But the most important part is the balance of policy. And the balance of policy is we're working now with policymakers and government to complement the GDP and balance of payments with that balance between energy and quantum. And very simply put, you have two sides, the assets and the liabilities, and you're going to put on one side what is it that you're doing as policies, on the other side, what is the impact of it. And that is the impact in terms of energy and in terms of quantum learning. And if your quantum learning is very wide, it means that there's a huge difference between what government is doing and what people are absorbing. Something should be done. That means either you're doing too much or not enough. And that regulation of doing too much or not enough eventually is the north. That's the balance of policy.
Clear. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, in listening to you, it seems that there's also implications here for government organized, how governments are organized, right? If you consider that there are all these interdependencies between policies and governance are organized vertically, as Chris was describing it earlier, there's a need to rethink on how to make the organization match these interdependencies, right? This whole of government approach.
And in effect, if I may, we're working now with policymakers to create national agendas, to think about whole of country approaches, not necessarily centralized, but working with different policymakers and involving population directly into the development of those policies.
Clear. Thank you. Thank you for these this introduction with these questions. I'm going to turn now to the broader audience here, the global audience that we have here today, to some questions. I will turn to a first question, which is pretty much, coming from the policymaker's perspective. And it's, turning to you is, why would a government today want to hire Whiteshield to support policy making with quantum governance? Concretely, what would it entail? What would they be getting?
Quantum is about gaining speeds and conversion. Speed meaning targeting different individuals, looking at their needs and wants. For example, a single woman, 2 children living in a remote area probably will need a separate type of unemployment policy and response than a potential investor, entrepreneur living in a large city. That tailoring of policy using data allows us to employ people much more quickly. And that's, for example, one project we've been adapting with a country. The other angle is becoming much more efficient in terms of communication and working with policymakers to target the narrative to different audiences and to make sure that whatever policy is being put forward is understood, not necessarily agreed to, but understood by different citizens. So that means concretely using algorithms that looks at what is the impact of policies, who are the winners, who are the losers, and how to adapt to make sure that the majority of the population is understanding that policy.
Okay. I mean, we have a related question from Philippe here, who is, concretely, when you're engaging with countries on this type of quantum approach, how do you engage with countries? What would be the format of working with them so that there's most impact in the quantum approach?
So maybe I'll give you two examples. One example is complementing GDP and balance of payments with the balance of policy. And that's something we're doing now with the two countries, adapting the framework, using their data and showing them where is that gap in terms of quantum governance. But also, based on this, ensuring that we are reviewing the policies using the regulatory guillotine to cut policies, because there are too many, that are not adapted. And one of the key implications is having an expiry date for public policies. We do not have this today. The second type is working with populations through accelerators to ensure that we adapt trade policies, unemployment policies on the ground, working with citizens in an accelerated manner to understand what are the exact needs and wants of that population. That is, again, adapted in the case of trade or labor, or even at the city level, improving the performance of a city.
Very good. We have another question globally here from Patrick, who's asking, maybe this is a question more directed to Chris, about the fact that there seems to be a trend from countries in terms of protecting citizen data, namely in France. This is a big issue because, as you were rightly saying earlier, citizens own the data and therefore you don't release it. And this could almost generate a contradiction with the whole approach of quantum, which needs this data. So would your position be more, do we protect this data or do we release this data? This is the question which is asked.
Yeah. I mean, the idea is that you release the data to those who are going to make good use of the data to improve your well-being, your standard of living, and so on. So it boils down to trust, because we're really talking about the government mainly. Whether you release it to other companies and so on, even those who have the ability to collect it, is something that you are given some kind of choice when you try to trade with those companies. But with government it's different. So it's really a question of trust. How much do you trust your government that it will make good use to your data? You could be given, for example, a long questionnaire might come from some policy-making section of the government and say, and you might be told we're collecting all this information about citizens, which will help us provide better services for you. It will take you 15 minutes to answer. Would you answer? I suspect most people will, but there will be some people who will say, no, I don't trust what we're going to do with that data. I'm going to say no, or give false answers to mislead them. I suspect that's what most people will do. Unfortunately, there isn't complete trust between citizens and government. If you see, there are organizations that collect all the level of trust which comes through questionnaire surveys of citizens, and they vary a lot. Some countries that, yes, of course, I could trust my government. Others would say, no, I wouldn't give them anything personal and all that, because I don't know how they're going to use it.
Interesting. Chris, you're making me think that you could apply the quantum in reverse on this question, where you could actually ask every citizen, you could apply a quantum approach to trust. And you basically ask every citizen, do you trust your government or not to release your data, yes or no? And then so in that case, you have a customized citizen-by-citizen approach of data
Yes,
release.
yes.
I mean, why not? You know, you
Yes.
could reverse it that way.
Yes.
Very good, very good. Now we have some creative questions here. One question from our global audience relates to application to companies here, and in particular, can you apply the quantum governance framework to a company-by-company approach, or is this just focused on citizens?
So both are important. And I think at the level of companies, the issue is that the accounting metrics that we have in companies are still very much related to P&L and balance sheet and so on, when we don't really measure the value of an individual. The value of an individual is simply the cost of the person, the salaries, and so on. Now, that value is what should be accounted for and pretty much taken at the national level. Valuing the capabilities, the skills, the competencies of people should be taken at the firm level. That is number one. Number two, quantum is taking the lowest unit, individuals. Companies are just an aggregate of those individuals. I will still come back to the individual.
Clear, clear. So we have lots of questions here. We're going to maybe shorten down to a few. One other one relates to the question of trade-offs between citizens, right? So how does quantum ensure that what might be good for one citizen is not hurting another citizen? This is a question from Vittorio here.
You want to take this one, Chris, or I'll take it?
Well, how does it do it? You know, you need to have even more data on these citizens. You need to work out how each demographic group or each, you know, even at the very granular level, you know, smaller demographic groups will be affected. And then a decision needs to be made if you are making some citizens better off than others, not better off or even worse off. It's a decision that needs to be made, and ultimately, it's a political decision. You know, you weigh the you know, what we economists call your welfare function. How much weight do you put on the way that it affects citizen A, and how much do you put on the way that affects citizen B? Of course, what you shouldn't do is to do it on the basis of how influential the citizen is and how much money is given you under the counter to make sure that the policy that you enact is one that benefits their group and not others. You know, that is certainly not something you would recommend in as quantum governance. But the decision is difficult. It's something that economists have been debating for more than 100 years since the famous economist of the past, Wilfredo Pareto, raised this point, and we still use, in fact, his name, whether it's Pareto improving, which means that you make some citizens better off but no one worse off, or whether it's not, in which case you need something to evaluate the policy. You know, if I tell you here is a policy which will save lives of people who suffer from a certain disease, but it's going to increase waiting times for hospitals for others who are not urgent. Do you do it? The answer is yes. That's more or less what we applied in COVID.
Yeah.
You know, patients that didn't have urgent needs, although in their mind it was urgent. If your hip hurt so much that you wanted it replaced quickly, were given low priority. Those who suffered from COVID infections were given high priority because we believed with some justification, in fact, that dealing with COVID saves lives, whereas the others, they're feeling the discomfort for a few more months. But
so luckily we have economists which give us tools like Pareto efficiency to make these trade-offs and decisions.
Exactly, where the world be without economists?
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, so we have many questions. Our time is limited, however. I'll take one more question from the global audience here. There's a very interesting one, maybe, which takes a different angle, which is taking the reader's perspective, right? Now, if you're not government, right, you're not a policymaker, but you're a citizen or you're an entrepreneur, and you're reading quantum governance, what should you take away from the book? What should you maybe do differently after you've read the book?
Well, maybe I'll take the analogy of the phone. You know, economists have a lot of answers, but probably we now moved on to the age of economists. We're now in the age of people and individuals. When you open this, you look at, you know, any social media, you're going to look at likes, you know, people like me, they don't like me, and so on. Well, the implications for individuals, for entrepreneurs, for people that read the book is, what is your return on policy? How much are you getting from governments? What is that return that you're getting? Are you getting optimal return for you as an individual? Not this average metric of productivity is going up and down, or GDP. You don't wake up in the morning and say GDP has gone up or down. But you wake up and say, I'm happy or not happy because I live longer, I have a job, I have good health, and so on. That is what you expect from governments. And this book is about expectations from government, but also that social contract that gives you data so that everyone can be better off using this information as opposed to using the siloed approach that we have today.
Okay, and probably the citizen would be maybe more aware of how they have control potentially over their data.
Absolutely.
And can use it or not use it in a company or government context.
And the more you give data, the more you should be expecting something good
in return.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's not about the taxes and getting a bridge being built anymore. It's not just about that.
All right. So again, coming back from those earlier words that were mentioned by Fadi, we're going from one to many to one to one. I think that's the whole idea behind quantum, and it's just the beginning. Lots of exciting things happening, and the technologies that we have are going to help accelerate this approach. So we're looking forward to the official launch of quantum governance, which will be in September. Pre-orders for the book, I believe, are already possible through Amazon.
Absolutely.
And looking forward to developing this wider quantum community. So thank you, everyone, globally, for participating, and have a good day. And thank you to Fadi Farra and Christopher Pissarides.
Thank you all.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.